The laughter in courtroom 4B was sharp, cruel, and entirely one-sided. It came from Silas Sterling, a man who believed his net worth of $40 million made him untouchable. He looked at his wife, Sandra, across the aisle, a woman wearing a faded department store cardigan, and actually chuckled when she asked for a fair settlement. He thought he had already won. He thought she was nothing but a footnote in his success story. But Silas didn't know that the grey-haired lawyer sitting next to her wasn't just checking his watch. He was waiting for the projector to warm up. In exactly 5 minutes, a single document displayed on that screen would not only silence Silas's laughter, but would strip him of everything he thought he owned. This is the story of how arrogance met its match in a dusty file marked The Kensington Legacy. The divorce trial of Sterling versus Sterling began on a rain-slicked Tuesday in November at the Superior Court of Seattle. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was suffocating, thick with the scent of floor wax and stale coffee, but for Silas Sterling, it smelled like victory. Silas sat at the plaintiff's table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. At 42, he was the picture of modern success, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a logistics software company that had revolutionized shipping routes in the Pacific Northwest. He checked his reflection in the dark screen of his tablet, smoothing back his silver-furred hair. He exuded the restless energy of a man who had more important places to be. To his right sat Julian Thorne, a divorce attorney whose reputation was as aggressive as his billing rate. Thorne was known in legal circles as the Butcher of Belltown. He didn't just win settlements, he annihilated the opposition. "Keep your face neutral, Silas," Thorne whispered, though he didn't look worried. "Judge Harrison is old-fashioned. He doesn't like cockiness. But don't worry, we have them cornered." Silas smirked, tapping his pen on the mahogany table. "I'm not cocky, Julian. I'm just realistic. Look at her." He gestured subtly with his chin toward the defense table. Sandra Sterling sat there, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was 39, but looked older today. She wore a beige cardigan that had seen better days and a simple black skirt. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She looked small, almost shrinking into the heavy wooden chair. To Silas, she looked exactly like what he claimed she was in the court filings, a dependent, a relic of a past life he had outgrown. Next to Sandra was her attorney, Amos Diggory. If Julian Thorne was a shark, Amos Diggory was a manatee. He was 70 years old, wearing a suit that looked like it had been purchased during the Reagan administration. His briefcase was battered leather, held together by duct tape on the handle. He was shuffling papers with a trembling hand, occasionally adjusting his thick bifocals. "It's almost sad," Silas whispered. "She hired Diggory. The guy probably pays for his office rent with coupons. Are you sure we even need to go full throttle? Maybe I should just offer her the condo in Tacoma and call it a day." "No," Thorne hissed. "She refused the initial offer. She wants equity, Silas. She wants a stake in Sterling Dynamics. We crush her, or she keeps coming back. We establish that she contributed nothing to the business. Absolute zero." "That's easy," Silas scoffed, loud enough for the court reporter to glance up. "Because it's the truth." The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the room. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. As the judge entered, a stern man with eyebrows like thunderclouds, Sandra finally looked up. Her eyes met Silas's. He expected to see fear or tears, the usual reaction when he exerted his dominance. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him for a brief second. Her eyes weren't wet. They were flat, cold, like the surface of a deep lake where something was moving just beneath the water. Silas shook off the feeling. "She's bluffing," he thought. "She has nothing." To understand why Silas felt so secure, you have to understand the history of the marriage. They met 15 years ago. Back then, Silas wasn't a CEO. He was a frantic coder working out of a garage in a rented duplex, drowning in student debt. Sandra was a librarian, quiet and studious, with a passion for archival history. For the first 5 years, Sandra paid for everything. She paid the rent, bought the groceries, and even paid for the servers Silas used to host the beta version of his software. She drove a 10-year-old sedan so Silas could lease a BMW to impress investors. When Sterling Dynamics finally took off, the dynamic shifted. The money started pouring in, first a trickle, then a flood. Silas began traveling: New York, London, Tokyo. He started buying better suits, drinking finer scotch, and spending less time at home. Sandra remained the same. She didn't like the galas. She preferred gardening and her volunteer work at the city archives. She wasn't the trophy wife Silas felt a CEO should have. The end came 6 months ago. Sandra had come to his office to surprise him with lunch for his birthday. She found him in his glass-walled conference room, not working, but sharing a bottle of champagne and a very intimate embrace with his 26-year-old VP of marketing, Jessica. Silas hadn't even apologized. "It's been over for years, Sandra," he had told her that night, packing a bag. "I've evolved. You haven't. You're still living like a librarian. I'm running an empire. It's time we stopped pretending we fit together." He had filed for divorce the next day, blocking her access to their joint accounts and leaving her with a personal credit card with a $500 limit. He wanted to starve her out, force a quick settlement, and move on with Jessica. But Sandra hadn't signed. She had gone to Amos Diggory. Now in the courtroom, Judge Harrison adjusted his robes and looked over his spectacles. "We are here for the matter of Sterling versus Sterling. I understand there is a dispute regarding the division of assets, specifically the valuation of the business entities." "Yes, Your Honor." Julian Thorne stood up, buttoning his jacket. "My client, Mr. Sterling, is the sole creator and operator of Sterling Dynamics. Mrs. Sterling has never held a position at the company, has never written a line of code, and has never secured a contract. We argue that the business is entirely separate property, created through my client's singular genius." Amos Diggory didn't stand up immediately. He slowly uncapped a cheap plastic pen. "Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy, "we argue that the business was built on a foundation funded entirely by Mrs. Sterling, and other assets that were leveraged without her full consent." Silas rolled his eyes. The supportive wife defense, he thought. Standard, boring, and easily beaten. "Very well," the judge said. "Mr. Thorne, call your first witness." Thorne wasted no time. He called Silas to the stand first. This was a strategic move designed to dominate the narrative early. "Mr. Sterling," Thorne began, pacing in front of the witness box, "can you tell the court about the founding of Sterling Dynamics?" Silas leaned into the microphone, using his best boardroom voice. Charismatic, authoritative, smooth. "I started the code in 2010. It was a singular vision. I worked 18-hour days. I sacrificed my health, my social life, everything to build the algorithm that now powers 40% of West Coast shipping." "And during this time," Thorne asked, "what was Mrs. Sterling's involvement?" Silas glanced at Sandra. She was looking down at her hands again. "Sandra kept the house," Silas said, with a tone that suggested this was a trivial task. "She did laundry, she cooked. But as for the business, she didn't understand it. She couldn't tell you the difference between Java and Python. She was a spectator." "Did she provide financial capital?" "She paid for groceries," Silas shrugged. "Small household bills. But the seed money? The investors? That was all me. I secured the venture capital. I took the risks. Thorne nodded, smiling. So, would you say her contribution to the $40 million valuation of your company is negligible? Silas said firmly. She was a passenger on a train I built and drove. The cross-examination from Amos Diggory was expected to be weak. The old man stood up, holding a piece of paper that shook slightly in his grip. Mr. Sterling, Amos said, you mentioned small household bills. Are you aware that between 2010 and 2014, your wife transferred her entire paycheck into your joint account every 2 weeks? I don't recall the specifics. Silas dismissed him. It was a long time ago. As I said, grocery money. And are you aware, Amos continued, peering over his glasses, that in 2012, when you were sued for copyright infringement by a competitor, the legal settlement of $50,000 was paid via a cashier's check? I believe so. Silas frowned. He hadn't thought about that lawsuit in years. Where did that money come from, Mr. Sterling? You were unemployed at the time. Silas hesitated. He honestly didn't remember. He just remembered the problem going away. I assume I took a loan. There is no record of a loan, Amos said quietly. But there is a record of Mrs. Sterling selling a piece of jewelry, a vintage sapphire brooch. Do you remember that? Silas laughed, a short, sharp sound. A brooch? You think a brooch saved my company? Look, if she wants 50 grand back with interest, fine. I'll write a check right now. But that doesn't give her half my company. It wasn't just a brooch, was it? Amos pressed. It was an heirloom. It was junk, Silas snapped, losing his cool for a second. Old dusty junk she got from her grandmother, just like everything else she owns. Look, she's a librarian. She likes old things. I like the future. That's why we're here. Amos paused. He looked at Silas with a strange expression, almost like pity. You believe Mrs. Sterling's inheritance was junk? I know it was, Silas said, leaning back. She comes from a line of farmers and nobodies in rural Oregon. She has nothing, Mr. Diggory, and frankly, this attempt to paint her as some financial savior is insulting to the actual work I did. Silas looked at the judge. She's just trying to cash out, Your Honor. It's greed, plain and simple. Sandra didn't move, but under the table her hand clenched into a fist so tight her knuckles turned white. No further questions, Amos said, and he sat down. Silas stepped down from the stand, winking at his lawyer. He had crushed it. He had painted her as a leech and himself as the victim of success. Call your next witness, the judge said. I have no further witnesses at this time, Thorne said. We rest our case regarding the division of assets. The judge turned to the defense table. Mr. Diggory, your opening witness? Amos Diggory stood up. He didn't call Sandra. He didn't call a character witness. Your Honor, Amos said, his voice suddenly losing its tremor, becoming clear and resonant. The defense calls no witnesses. A murmur went through the courtroom. Even Silas looked confused. No witnesses? They were giving up? However, Amos continued, I would like to submit a piece of evidence that was previously sealed due to a non-disclosure agreement that expired yesterday. He lifted a heavy, bound document from his battered briefcase. It was stamped with a wax seal, red and intricate. I present to the court Exhibit G, Amos said, the last will and testament of Archibald Kensington and the subsequent patent registry of 1955. Silas frowned. Kensington. The name sounded vaguely familiar, like a street name or a brand of tea. Mr. Sterling mocked his wife's background, Amos said, walking toward the projector in the center of the room. He called her family nobodies. He called her inheritance junk. He believes he is the only person in this room who understands the value of intellectual property. Amos placed a transparency on the projector. The machine hummed to life, a beam of light cutting through the dust motes of the courtroom. "Mr. Sterling," Amos said, looking directly at Silas, "you might want to look at the screen." The hum of the projector fan seemed to be the loudest sound in the world. On the screen, a yellow document appeared. It was typed on an old typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, with a date stamped in the corner, October 14th, 1955. At the top of the page, in bold, capitalized letters, it read, "The Kensington Optimization Protocol, a mathematical framework for variable logistics." Silas squinted at the screen. At first, it just looked like gibberish, rows of complex equations and diagrams of shipping containers. But as his eyes scanned the third paragraph, his heart hammered against his ribs. The equations, he knew them. He didn't just know them. He had typed them into his terminal 10 years ago. They were the backbone of Sterling Dynamics. They were the secret sauce he claimed to have invented in a fever dream of genius. "What is this?" Silas whispered, his face draining of color. Amos Diggory walked around the table, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. In the 1950s, a man named Archibald Kensington worked as a logistics clerk at the port of Seattle. He was a quiet man, obsessed with efficiency. He spent his nights writing a mathematical formula to predict shipping delays before they happened. He called it the Kensington Protocol. Amos clicked a button, and the slide changed. It showed a photo of an old man holding a baby. "Archibald never sold his idea," Amos continued. "He didn't trust the corporations of his time. He patented it, locked it in a safety deposit box, and died with very little money. That baby in the photo is his granddaughter, Sandra Kensington. Now Sandra Sterling." Julian Thorne, Silas's lawyer, stood up abruptly. "Objection! Relevance! This is a history lesson, not a divorce trial. Unless this Kensington fellow left Mrs. Sterling millions of dollars in cash, this has no bearing on my client's company." "On the contrary," Amos said, his eyes sharp behind the thick lenses. "It has everything to do with your client's company, because Sterling Dynamics doesn't exist without this document." Amos turned to Sandra. "Mrs. Sterling, did you ever show your husband your grandfather's old journals?" Sandra spoke clearly into the microphone, her voice steady. "Yes. 7 years ago. We were cleaning out the attic. I found a box of Grandpa Archie's papers. I showed them to Silas because I thought the math looked interesting. Silas told me it was—" "What was the word you used, Silas?" She looked directly at him. "Gibberish," Sandra said. "He told me it was outdated gibberish and told me to throw the box away." "And did you?" Amos asked. "No," Sandra said. "I kept it. But I noticed Silas spent the next 3 months locked in his office, rewriting his entire code base." Amos turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we have hired an independent forensic code auditor from MIT. They compared the Sterling algorithm with the Kensington Protocol from 1955. Amos dropped a thick binder onto the judge's bench with a heavy thud. "It is a 98% match," Amos declared, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "Mr. Sterling didn't invent anything. He translated his wife's inheritance into computer code, claimed it as his own, and built a $40 million empire on stolen intellectual property." The courtroom erupted. Reporters in the back row started typing furiously on their phones. Silas felt the room spinning. He gripped the edge of the table. "This is ridiculous!" he shouted, standing up. "It's math! You can't steal math! I built the interface. I sold the contracts." "You built the car," Amos countered, pointing a shaking finger at him. But she owns the engine, and according to the patent laws of 1955, which were renewed by the estate, she owns the rights to any derivative works. Amos smiled, a cold, shark-like smile that matched his opponent's. That means, Mr. Sterling, that technically, Sterling Dynamics belongs to Sandra. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Judge Harrison looked stunned. He picked up the binder Amos had dropped and began flipping through the pages, his eyebrows climbing higher with every chart he saw. Julian Thorne was frantically whispering to Silas, "Is this true? Did you see those papers? Silas, look at me. If this is true, we are not looking at a settlement. We are looking at fraud." "I improved it," Silas hissed back, sweat beading on his forehead. "I digitized it. It was just paper in a box until I touched it." "That's an admission," Thorne groaned, putting his head in his hands. "You just admitted it on the record." Judge Harrison slammed his gavel. "Order. Mr. Thorne, control your client." The judge looked down at Silas with a gaze that could peel paint. "Mr. Sterling, the court takes allegations of IP theft very seriously, especially when used to hide assets in a marital dispute. If Mrs. Sterling owns the underlying IP of your company, the valuation of your separate property drops to zero." "It's not zero," Silas yelled, losing his composure entirely. "I am the face of the company. The clients buy from me." "Actually," Sandra spoke up again. It was the first time she had interrupted. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Silas. "The clients buy efficiency, Silas. They don't care about your face. They care about the algorithm." She stood up slowly. The faded cardigan didn't look cheap anymore. It looked like the attire of someone who didn't need to impress anyone. "I tried to be fair," Sandra said softly. "I asked for 50%. I asked for recognition of the years I supported you. I asked for the house. You laughed at me. You told me I was nothing." She walked around the table, approaching the center aisle. "My attorney, Mr. Diggory, advised me to sue for full ownership of the company," Sandra said. "He told me I could strip you of everything. The brand, the building, the accounts. I could leave you with nothing but your Armani suits." Silas stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Genuine, primal fear. He realized he didn't know the woman standing in front of him. He had married a librarian, but he was divorcing a Kensington. "But I don't want to run a logistics company," Sandra continued. "I have my books. I have my garden." Silas felt a flicker of hope. "Sandra," he said, his voice trembling. "Baby, we can work this out. We can—" "Don't call me that," she snapped. The sharpness in her voice silenced him instantly. "I am offering you a deal, Silas," Sandra said, pulling a single sheet of paper from her folder, "because I am not cruel. Not like you." She slid the paper across the polished wood toward him. "You can keep the company," she said. Silas blinked. "What?" "You keep the title of CEO. You keep the office. You keep the glory," she said. "But in exchange, you will sign over 90% of all future profits to me as a licensing fee for the Kensington Protocol. You will work for me, Silas, forever." Julian Thorne grabbed the paper and read it. His face went pale. "Silas," he whispered, This is an ironclad licensing agreement. If you sign this, you're essentially her employee. You'll be making a salary, and she gets the dividends." "And if I don't sign?" Silas asked, his voice a dry croak. Amos Diggory piped up from his chair. "Then we file a federal injunction today. We shut down Sterling Dynamics for copyright infringement. The servers go off tonight. Your clients, Amazon, FedEx, DHL, they all lose their shipping data tomorrow morning. The company goes bankrupt within a week, and you will likely face criminal charges for fraud." The weight of the ultimatum crushed the room. Silas looked at the judge. The judge just shrugged, as if to say, "It's your funeral." He looked at Jessica, his young VP mistress, sitting in the gallery. She was looking at her phone, frantically texting, probably realizing her meal ticket was about to bounce. He looked at Sandra. She wasn't smiling. She was just waiting. "The shark in the Armani suit," Sandra whispered, echoing the nickname he loved. "Let's see if you can swim in a tank you don't own." Silas picked up the pen. His hand shook violently. He looked at the 90% figure. It was slavery. It was humiliation. It was the end of his life as a master of the universe. But the alternative was prison and poverty. With a scream of frustration trapped in his throat, Silas signed the paper. He pressed down so hard the pen tore through the page. The drive from the courthouse back to the Sterling Dynamics headquarters was a blur of grey rain and red taillights. Silas gripped the steering wheel of his Porsche until his knuckles turned the color of bone. He had expected to feel relief. After all, he had avoided bankruptcy and prison. He had technically won the right to keep his title. But as the adrenaline of the courtroom faded, a cold, creeping realization began to settle in his gut like wet concrete. He parked in his reserved spot, CEO Silas Sterling, painted in bold white letters on the asphalt. For the first time in 10 years, the sign looked like a mockery. Silas smoothed his tie, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, and put on the mask. The mask of the untouchable genius. The mask of the alpha. He told himself that nothing had really changed. He was still the boss. He was still the man who signed the paychecks. Sandra was just a silent partner, a ghost in the machine. He would go upstairs, bark a few orders, terrify a few junior developers, and everything would go back to normal. But the moment he stepped through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, he knew the world had shifted on its axis. The security guard, a man named Frank who usually greeted him with a sharp salute and a cheerful, "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," didn't look up. Frank was staring at his phone, scrolling through a news feed. Silas could see the reflection in the plexiglass barrier. It was a photo of Silas leaving the courthouse, looking pale and sweaty. The headline was blurry, but the word fraud was distinct. "Frank," Silas barked, swiping his keycard aggressively. Frank jumped, almost dropping his phone. He looked at Silas, and for a split second, there was no deference in his eyes. There was only curiosity. Pity, perhaps. "Oh. Afternoon, Mr. Sterling," Frank mumbled, hitting the button to open the gate. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how the day was. He just watched Silas pass through, his eyes lingering on Silas's back a second too long. The elevator ride to the 40th floor was a silent, claustrophobic nightmare. Silas was alone, but he felt the weight of the building pressing down on him. When the doors slid open to the executive floor, the hum of the open plan office hit him. Usually, the sound of typing and low conversation was the music of his empire. Today, it sounded like a hive that had been disturbed. As he walked down the central aisle, the silence spread outward from him like a ripple in a pond. He passed the marketing department. 2 interns were huddled over a tablet, whispering giggles. When they saw him, they snapped straight, burying their faces in their screens. But Silas saw the smirk on one of their faces. They weren't working. They were reading the live blogs. They were reading about the brooch. They were reading about the Kensington Protocol. They know, Silas thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. They all know I didn't write the code. He reached the sanctuary of his corner office, the glass-walled fortress that overlooked the Puget Sound. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. He needed to assert dominance. He needed to do something that proved he was still the captain of this ship. He marched to his desk, sat in his ergonomic leather chair, and woke up his computer. His 3 monitors flared to life. "Okay," he muttered to himself. Back to work, business as usual. He pulled up the interface for the upcoming merger with a logistics firm in Tokyo. It was a massive deal, one that required an immediate transfer of funds to secure the international shipping lanes. He navigated to the company's primary treasury account. He needed to authorize a wire transfer for $250,000 for the initial deposit. He entered his credentials. User: M. Sterling. Password. He hit enter, expecting the familiar green confirmation bar. Instead, the screen flickered. A harsh, dissonant chime rang out from his speakers, a sound he had never heard before. A grey dialog box popped up in the center of his primary monitor, obscuring his wallpaper. System alert. Unauthorized transaction. Error code 403. Expenditure exceeds discretionary limit. Status: pending trustee approval. Silas stared at the screen, blinking. What? He tried again. He re-entered the numbers. He hit enter harder this time. System alert. Action blocked. Please contact administrator. "I am the administrator!" Silas screamed at the empty room. He grabbed his mouse and slammed it against the desk. His office door creaked open. Silas spun around, his face red with rage. It was David, his chief financial officer. David was a nervous man with thinning hair who usually sweated when Silas looked at him. Today, David looked terrified, holding a tablet to his chest like a shield. "What is this, David?" Silas snarled, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "Why is the system locking me out of the Tokyo transfer? Fix it. Now." David didn't move. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I can't fix it, Silas." "What do you mean you can't fix it? You're the CFO. Override the protocol." "It's the new bylaws," David whispered, stepping into the room but leaving the door slightly open, as if he wanted an escape route. The court order was processed at noon. The bank pushed a firmware update to our financial suite immediately. The new governance structure is hard-coded into the system. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. "Hard-coded?" "Yes," David said, looking at his shoes. "Any expenditure over $10,000 requires a dual-signature digital key. One key is yours. The other key belongs to the majority stakeholder." "Sandra," Silas spat the name out like a curse. "Her legal proxy, actually," David corrected. "Mr. Diggory, the system automatically routed your request to his office. You can't move the money until he clicks approve on his end." Silas sank back into his chair. He felt dizzy. He wasn't just an employee. He was a child asking for an allowance. The humiliation was total. He had built this interface. He had designed the user experience to be seamless, fast, powerful. And now, his own creation was treating him like a thief. "So what do I do?" Silas asked, his voice hollow. "You have to submit a requisition form," David said softly. "Form 12B, justification for expenditure. You have to explain why you need the money, attach the invoices, and submit it to the proxy portal." "I have to ask for permission to do my job." "Yes." Silas closed his eyes. He wanted to fire David. He wanted to fire everyone on this floor. But he realized with a sick jolt that he probably couldn't even buy a severance package without Amos Diggory's permission. "Get out," Silas whispered. "Silas, there's one more thing," David said, his voice trembling again. "Payroll is tomorrow." Silas opened his eyes. "So?" "The total payroll for the company is $2 million. That exceeds the limit. You need to submit a request for that, too, by 5 p.m. today, or the staff doesn't get paid." David turned and fled the office, closing the door softly behind him. Silas looked at the clock. It was 3:45 p.m. For the next hour, the Shark of Seattle sat hunched over his keyboard, typing. He wasn't writing brilliant code. He wasn't closing million-dollar deals. He was filling out a web form that looked like it belonged to the DMV. Reason for request: monthly payroll. Beneficiary: staff of Sterling Dynamics. Urgency: high. He attached the spreadsheets. He double-checked the numbers. His pride was burning to ash with every keystroke. He had to justify the salary of the janitor. He had to justify the salary of the interns who were laughing at him. Finally, he hit submit. Status: pending review. He waited. The minutes ticked by. 4:15 p.m., 4:30 p.m. He paced the office. He stared out the window at the grey skyline. If Amos didn't approve it, the company would implode. The staff would walk out. It would be the end. Was Sandra cruel enough to let the company burn just to spite him? At 4:48 p.m., his assistant, Sarah, knocked on the door. She held a piece of thermal paper in her hand. A fax. "This came through on the secure line, sir," she said, not making eye contact. Silas snatched the paper from her hand. It was still warm. He looked at the header. Law Offices of Amos Diggory. Below that, in handwritten script that was shaky but legible, was a message that cut deeper than any knife. Mr. Sterling, payroll request authorized. Funds have been released. Please ensure your staff is compensated promptly. However, upon reviewing the attached miscellaneous budget, I noticed a line item for $5,000 labeled Executive Client Retention, Spirits and Dining. Mrs. Sterling has flagged this as unnecessary overhead. The budget for office alcohol is hereby reduced to 0. I suggest sparkling water. It is better for the complexion. Regards, Amos Diggory, Trustee. Silas crushed the fax in his fist. He threw it across the room. It hit the window and fell harmlessly to the floor. He couldn't breathe in here. The air conditioning felt too cold. The glass walls felt like the sides of an aquarium. Everyone was watching the fish struggle. He could feel their eyes on him. The developers, the managers, the assistants. They weren't afraid of him anymore. They were tolerating him. He was just a figurehead, a mascot in a suit. He needed to leave. He needed to go somewhere where he was still a king. He grabbed his coat and his briefcase. He ignored the urgent emails piling up in his inbox. He walked out of his office, past Sarah, past David, past the smirking interns. He kept his chin up, but his stride was too fast, too desperate. He needed Jessica. Jessica was the only thing he had left. She was the one win he had secured from the wreckage of his marriage. She was young, brilliant, and she looked at him with adoration, or at least she used to. They would go to the penthouse, the one asset he had hidden, the secret condo in downtown Seattle that Sandra and her bloodhound lawyer didn't know about. He would pour a drink, a real drink, not sparkling water. And he and Jessica would plot their comeback. They would start a new company. They would crush Sandra. Silas stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the garage, stabbing it repeatedly with his finger. "It's not over," he whispered to his reflection in the polished steel doors. "I still have the penthouse. I still have Jessica. I still have the future." But as the elevator descended, dropping him down into the darkness of the parking garage, Silas Sterling had no idea that the ground floor was not the bottom. He was about to find out that rock bottom has a basement, and the person holding the key to it was waiting for him at home. The elevator to the penthouse of the Lumiere Tower did not have buttons. It required a retinal scan. Silas leaned in, letting the red laser map his eye, and felt a brief surge of the old power return when the doors slid open silently. This was his sanctuary, his secret fortress. While the rest of his life was being dissected by lawyers and accountants, this apartment remained off the grid. He had bought it 6 months ago, using Apex Holdings LLC, a shell company he had created specifically to hide assets from the divorce proceedings. Sandra didn't know it existed. Amos Diggory didn't know. The world thought Silas Sterling was sleeping on a friend's couch or in a hotel, but in reality, he owned the crown jewel of Seattle's skyline, a $5 million glass box in the sky. He stepped out into the private foyer, shaking the rain from his coat. He expected the warm amber glow of the smart lighting system. He expected the smell of jasmine and sandalwood from the diffusers Jessica insisted on keeping in every room. He expected the soft hum of jazz music. Instead, he stepped into darkness. The air was stale, cold, and smelled faintly of dust. "Jessica!" Silas called out. His voice didn't just echo, it bounced around the room with a hollow metallic ring that shouldn't have been possible in a furnished apartment. He fumbled for the light switch on the wall. The overhead track lights flickered on, casting harsh, clinical shadows across the room. Silas froze. His briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a loud thud. The living room was gone. The Italian leather sectional, imported from Milan for $40,000? Gone. The 85-inch 8K television that took up an entire wall? Gone. The abstract sculptures, the Persian rugs, the grand piano he didn't know how to play but loved to look at. All of it was gone. The penthouse was a cavern of bare hardwood floors and white walls. The only things remaining were the built-in fixtures and the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the rain-soaked city. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. "Jessica!" he screamed, running toward the master bedroom. "We've been robbed! Jessica!" He burst into the bedroom. It, too, was stripped. The king-sized bed frame, the silk sheets, the bedside tables, vanished. But the room wasn't entirely empty. In the center of the vast, empty bedroom sat a single, cheap metal folding chair. And sitting on that chair, scrolling through her phone with the casual boredom of someone waiting for a bus, was Jessica. She was dressed immaculately in a trench coat and sunglasses, despite being indoors. Next to her stood 2 large Louis Vuitton suitcases, the ones Silas had bought her for their trip to Paris last year. She looked up as he entered, sliding her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. Her expression wasn't fearful. It wasn't relieved to see him. It was completely, terrifyingly blank. "Stop screaming, Silas," she said, her voice calm. "The neighbors will complain, and the HOA here is very strict about noise violations." Silas stood in the doorway, chest heaving. "Robbed! We've been robbed. Everything is gone. How did they get past security? Are you hurt?" Jessica let out a short, dry laugh. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles on her coat. "We weren't robbed, darling. I liquidated." Silas blinked, his brain struggling to process the word. "You... what?" "Liquidated," Jessica repeated, enunciating the word slowly. "I sold it. All of it. The furniture, the art, the electronics. You'd be amazed what you can get for barely used designer goods on the secondary market. A liquidator came this morning with a truck. He paid cash." She patted her purse. It looked heavy. "Why?" Silas whispered, stepping into the room. "Why would you do that? Jessica, that was our home. I needed that sofa. I needed a drink. I've had the worst day of my life, and I come home to this?" "I know about your day," Jessica said, checking her manicure. "I saw the news. The puppet CEO. That's what they're calling you on Twitter. It's trending, actually." "Stop it," Silas snapped. "I don't care what they call me. I'm still rich. I still have this place. We can rebuild. I'll buy new furniture tomorrow. Better furniture. But you have to explain to me why you sold my things." Jessica turned to face him fully. For the first time, Silas saw the look in her eyes. It was a look he recognized. He had seen it in the mirror 1,000 times. It was the look of a predator assessing a wounded animal. "They weren't your things, Silas," she said softly. "They belonged to the apartment, and the apartment belongs to Apex Holdings, LLC. "Which is me," Silas shouted, slamming his hand against the wall. "Apex is me. I just kept my name off the paperwork to hide it from Sandra's lawyers. You know that. We planned it together." "We did," Jessica nodded. "You were so clever. You said, 'I need a proxy, someone I trust completely, someone whose name won't raise any red flags.' So you made me the sole managing member of Apex Holdings." She walked over to her suitcase and pulled out a thick document bound in blue paper. She tossed it onto the floor at Silas's feet. "Do you remember signing that?" she asked. Silas looked down. It was the operating agreement for the LLC. He remembered the night he signed it. He had been drinking champagne, celebrating his genius, laughing about how he was outsmarting Amos Diggory. He had signed over complete control of the entity to Jessica Miller, confident that she was just an extension of his own will. "That was a formality," Silas said, his voice trembling. "A legal fiction. In the eyes of the law, fiction is reality if the paperwork is signed," Jessica said. "You gave me the company, Silas. You gave me the asset. Legally, I own this penthouse. I own everything in it. And you? You are a guest. An unwelcome one." Silas felt the room spinning. The betrayal was so absolute, so comprehensive he couldn't breathe. "But I did this for us. For our future." "Silas," Jessica sighed, shaking her head like a disappointed teacher. "Look at you. You're a 42-year-old man who has to ask his ex-wife for permission to buy a bottle of vodka. You have a salary cap. You have a morality clause in your contract now. You're not a titan of industry anymore. You're a gelding." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "I didn't fall in love with Silas Sterling, the man. I fell in love with Silas Sterling, the lifestyle. I fell in love with the private jets, the unchecked power, the fear people had when you walked into a room. That man doesn't exist anymore. You're just middle management." "I love you," Silas choked out. It was a desperate, pathetic plea, and he hated himself for saying it. "No, you don't," Jessica corrected him. "You love that I'm young, and I'm hot, and I make you feel like you're not aging. But I'm not going to waste my prime years nursing the ego of a man who got outsmarted by a librarian." She grabbed the handle of her suitcase. "I'm leaving, Silas. I accepted a job in Dubai, logistics. They pay in gold, apparently. And since I had full control of Apex Holdings, I sold the penthouse this morning." Silas staggered back as if she had punched him. You sold the apartment?" "Cash buyer, a tech bro from California. He didn't care about the furniture, thank God. We closed escrow at 4 p.m. The deed is recorded. The money has been wired to an offshore account that you can't touch." "This is fraud," Silas screamed, tears finally spilling over. "I'll sue you. I'll tell the court it was a sham. I'll tell them I hid the assets." Jessica smiled. It was the most dangerous smile he had ever seen. "Go ahead. Please do it. Go to Judge Harrison and admit that you committed perjury during your divorce trial. Admit that you hid $5 million in assets. You'll go to prison, Silas, for years. And by the time you get out, I'll be on a yacht in the Mediterranean, and this money will be long gone." She had him. She had him in a vice grip, and she knew it. If he fought her, he destroyed himself. If he let her go, he lost everything. It was checkmate. "How could you be so cold?" Silas whispered. "I taught you everything you know." "Exactly," Jessica said. "You taught me that emotions are weaknesses. You taught me that the only thing that matters is leverage. You taught me to take what I want." She shrugged. "I was a very good student." She began to walk toward the door, her heels clicking loudly on the bare wood, a countdown clock to the end of his life. But at the doorway, she stopped. She turned back one last time. "Oh, there is one thing," she said, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "I think you should know. I didn't come up with this idea on my own." Silas looked up from the floor, wiping his eyes. "What?" "The sale, the liquidation. Leaving you with nothing," Jessica said. "I was actually going to just break up with you and leave. But then, I got a phone call yesterday." "Who called you?" "Sandra," Jessica said. The name hit Silas harder than the loss of the money. "Sandra called you?" "She did," Jessica grinned. "She's very polite, your ex-wife. She called to tell me that she knew about the penthouse. Apparently, she found the Apex Holdings paperwork months ago in your home office, but never told her lawyer. She kept it as an insurance policy." Silas felt bile rise in his throat. Sandra had known. The whole time he was sitting in court, thinking he had one secret left, she had known. "She offered me a deal," Jessica continued, savoring the moment. "She told me that if she revealed the apartment to the court, the judge would seize it, sell it, and split the money. It would be messy. So she gave me a choice. She said, 'Jessica, you can keep the money. You can sell the apartment. Keep the cash. Keep the furniture money. Keep it all. I won't sue you. I won't come after you.'" "Why?" Silas rasped. "Why would she give you $5 million? "I asked her that," Jessica said. "I asked her, 'Why are you letting the mistress get rich?' And do you know what she said?" Jessica leaned against the doorframe, her eyes gleaming with malice. "She said, 'The money doesn't matter to me. What matters is that Silas loses it. And I know that it will hurt him infinitely more if you are the one who steals it from him. If the court takes it, he'll feel like a victim. If you take it, he'll feel like a fool." Jessica laughed. She was right, wasn't she? It hurt so much more this way. She didn't just beat you, Silas. She weaponized me against you. She paid $5 million just to watch your heart break. Silas couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The realization crushed him. Sandra, the woman he had called a nobody, the woman he had mocked for wearing cardigans and reading old books, had orchestrated his destruction with the precision of a grandmaster. She hadn't just taken his company, she had taken his dignity. She had turned his own greed into a trap, and his own mistress into the executioner. "Goodbye, Silas," Jessica said, opening the front door. "The new owners get the keys at 8 a.m. Security will escort you out if you're still here. I wouldn't make a scene if I were you. Frank downstairs is dying for a reason to tase you." The heavy door slammed shut. The sound was final, like the lid of a coffin closing. Silas sat alone on the floor of the empty, multi-million-dollar box. The lights of the city twinkled outside. Seattle, the kingdom he thought he ruled. But from down here on the floor, the Space Needle looked like a needle indeed, ready to prick the bubble of his ego. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his banking app. Balance. 4,200 Watersalts. That was it. That was all he had in the world. He had a job he hated, a boss he had divorced, and a future that belonged to someone else. He laid back on the cold, hard wood and stared up at the track lights until they burned spots into his vision. He thought about the laughter in the courtroom. He thought about mocking Sandra. He thought about the brooch he had called junk. And then, in the silence of the empty penthouse, Silas Sterling began to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a jagged, broken sound that tore through his throat. He laughed until he choked, laughed until the tears ran hot into his ears, realizing too late that while he was playing checkers, Sandra had been playing 4D chess, and she had just cleared the board. Silas spent the night on that floor. The next morning, he put on his suit, walked to the office, and submitted a request to buy a coffee. He is still the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, but he never enters the boardroom without looking at the portrait of Archibald Kensington hanging on the wall, a constant reminder that arrogance is a loan, and eventually, life calls in the debt with interest. What a brutal way to learn a lesson. Do you think Sandra went too far by letting Jessica steal the money? Or was it the perfect revenge for how Silas treated her? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes justice, please smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I have an even crazier revenge story coming next week, involving a lottery ticket and an unfaithful husband. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.